Good evening. So, my name is Mark. I'm the president of HIAS. Now, HIAS is the oldest refugee organization in the world. It's also the only global refugee organization that's Jewish. What does that mean? It used to mean that we welcomed refugees because they were Jewish. Today, it means we welcome refugees because we are Jewish. Now, in 2015, the world refugee crisis had really reached a crescendo, but not many people were noticing. Frankly, the White House didn't notice, the Obama administration didn't notice, the American Jewish community hadn't really noticed, until September of that year, when that photograph of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy whose dead body laid on the beach in Turkey, his photograph appeared on the front page of every newspaper. It woke all of us up, finally to realize that the human depth of the refugee crisis, the biggest crisis since the Second World War. Every rabbi in America, it seemed, talked about the refugee crisis during the high holidays that year. But then 2 months later, a terrible event happened, which were the terrorist attacks in Paris on November the 13th. And the reaction in this country to those attacks was really disturbing, something that we really haven't seen since maybe the 1920s. The reaction to those terrorist attacks in Paris was that 31 governors and 14 presidential candidates of one of the two parties stoked fear across the country through the old tactic of blaming the victim. They pledged to close America's doors to Syrian Muslim refugees. 31 governors actually said they would not allow Syrian Muslim refugees into their states. We were worried about how our community would react, but we shouldn't have been, because we all stood our ground. From the Reform movement to the Orthodox Union, hundreds of rabbis across America reacted by signing a HIAS statement that we keep our doors open to refugees. Then in 2016, one of those candidates was elected. We issued an even stronger letter, we being the Jewish community, prior to the inauguration, demanding that we keep America's doors open to refugees of all faiths and ethnicities. That letter has now been signed by 2,006 rabbis from 48 states, and 397 congregations have joined our welcome campaign to welcome refugees to this country. Now, last year, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the President signed an executive order that effectively banned refugees and many Muslims from this country. The reaction was spontaneous and unbelievable, with people from all over the country, including many Jews, taking to the airports, taking to the streets to chant, "No hate, no fear, refugees are welcome here." Thousands of Jews participated in HIAS's National Day of Jewish Action for Refugees last February 12, 2017. And that support helped embolden HIAS to risk the wrath of our biggest funder, the United States government. So we filed lawsuits against the White House and against the refugee and Muslim bans. We were the only one of 9 national refugee resettlement agencies to do so. This also inspired our partner agencies, the Jewish Family and Community Services of East Bay, the Jewish Family Service of Seattle, and the Jewish Family Services of Silicon Valley, to file their own lawsuits against the White House and the refugee ban. These lawsuits resulted in, for the first time in history, court rulings for refugees and against the White House. Now, what's changed since that executive order was signed more than 1 year ago? I'd like to tell you things have changed for the better, but they haven't. Things have continued to get worse. The global refugee crisis is no longer just the biggest since the Second World War, it's the biggest in human history. It's the biggest in recorded history. Since last year, more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees fled into Bangladesh, bringing up the total number of Rohingya refugees to over 1.1 million. More than that number have fled South Sudan during that time. In Syria, 2.1 million more Syrians fled their homes. 700,000 internally displaced persons went back from Syria, but 2.1 million had to flee their homes. The UN predicts that this year another 1.5 million people will have to flee Syria. More than half that country is already displaced. More than 700,000 people over the last year have fled Venezuela, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees just ruled that they too are to be regarded as refugees. Now, we can't solve the refugee crisis in the world through refugee resettlement, through bringing refugees here. But we do need to show leadership, and right now, the United States is not showing that leadership. By resettling refugees, countries like the United States can demonstrate leadership and share responsibility with refugee hosting countries, because we know that those countries that host refugees tend to be the poorest countries in the world. Now, the US right now is leading the world in a race to the bottom in terms of how refugees are treated as the refugee crisis gets worse and worse. And we need you to find that energy again that you found last year and to provide a strong counterforce to this. While the US does continue to be the single largest country donor for refugee assistance, the Trump administration continues to strive to lower that level each year. In fact, in 2017, we spent $3.4 billion assisting refugees. The president has asked to spend $2.8 billion next year. And yet refugees with unmet needs are growing by the millions. The administration seeks to cut hundreds of millions of dollars from their refugee assistance budget. And in terms of our leading by example by accepting more refugees into this country, in the last full year of the Obama administration, the US admitted 85,000 refugees. Obama pledged to admit 110,000 in 2017, but that number was driven down by the current administration to 53,000. This year, the ceiling is set at 45,000, the lowest since the Refugee Act was passed in 1980. And it gets even worse than that, because as of February 28th, we have only admitted 9,675 this fiscal year. This means that at this rate, we will resettle less than 24,000 refugees. And it gets worse. There are nearly 300,000 refugees overseas who are actually in queue for the refugee program. And this is not something they can simply apply for. They have to be basically invited to apply for it by the US government. 300,000 in queue. Most of these people aren't actually being denied refugee status. Their cases are just being set aside, often on the basis of secret evidence, which they will never be allowed to see, let alone overcome. And even if they do receive a denial, in many cases the denial will just say, we are denying your cases as a matter of discretion. And it gets worse. We've seen civil servants who work in the refugee program pushed out of their jobs over the last year, forced into retirement. One was famously even reassigned to work in the file room. A Stephen Miller disciple was just appointed to head the refugee program at the State Department. We don't know what that's going to mean for the program, but our role as a refugee resettlement agency, our days may be numbered at HIAS. There are record numbers of asylum seekers in this country, 311,000 pending cases right now, an 18-fold increase over the last 5 years. But the Attorney General ruled recently, just last week, Attorney General Sessions ruled that an asylum seeker is not necessarily entitled to a hearing anymore. We don't know what that means, but we know it's not good. And of course, the other country that many of us love, Israel, one of the first signers of the Refugee Convention. They signed it 16 years before the United States did. Israel, I hate to tell you, it's not being a light unto the nations either these days in its treatment of asylum seekers. While the number of asylum seekers in Israel are under control, they've stated about 37,000 for the last few years, thanks to the Prime Minister's fence. The Prime Minister announced earlier this year that on April 1st, ironically, on the second day of Passover, he will begin to forcibly deport asylum seekers, or as he calls them, illegal work, migrant infiltrators, to countries they have never lived in before, under secret agreements with those countries. That plan has been temporarily set aside by the High Court a few days ago, but only temporarily, so we'll have to see where that is. Now, we have spent the last, well, since 1948, so the last 70 years, building institutions to protect asylum seekers to make sure that never again are people trapped inside of a genocide the way they were during the Shoah, with no right to flee. Never again would a boat like the St. Louis be turned back to the persecutors of the people on that boat. And now all those institutions are in danger of being torn down, not just in this country, but in other countries. But we know, we showed last year, that if we speak up and step out and maintain our energy, we can make a difference. We need to make a difference. We can't be quiet. We can't accept this as the new normal. We have too much to lose. And I'll close by citing something that Rabbi Rick Jacobs said at the Jewish General Assembly in 2012, well before the Trump era, well before the global refugee crisis really caught everyone's attention. Rabbi Jacobs asked, which is the more Jewish act? Welcoming the Sabbath bride, or welcoming the refugee who has fled persecution? That's a tough one. Thank you.